Let's talk about P3s. P3 is really a very foreign concept. It's not how America has done construction traditionally throughout the years. So I will give you some background as to what P3 is. There's not a universal definition. When there's not, I often look to the Federal Highway Administration for their guidance. And what the Federal Highway Administration defines a P3 as is a contractual agreement formed between a public agency and a private sector that allows for greater private sector participation in the delivery and financing of transportation projects. This may seem strange to you, but for example, in states such as Virginia, this has been a common practice now for 2 decades. Also, some of you may be looking forward to my John Landau Rolling Stone type quote that I made last year, but 2014 was a very bad year for Rolling Stone magazine, so I'm not going to use them as a source anymore. So what you have here, and the reason why we have P3s becoming more and more prevalent, is a lot of state, in my opinion, is a lot of state governments came out of the recession in really bad shape, as did the federal government, and there isn't the money out there that's needed for transportation projects. We have a crumbling infrastructure in this country, and we don't have the money to fix it. Best example I can give to you of that is the 35W bridge that collapsed in Minneapolis, just literally a few hundred yards away from my law school, which miraculously there were only about 20 deaths. There could have been hundreds. So the governments realized we need to fix this infrastructure before there are more accidents. And what they decided was, let's get the private enterprises involved. Number one, to finance, and two, to give their superior expertise to ours so that these projects could be more economical. So the way it works is the P3 entity provides the government or public entity with a fixed cost of the asset for the meaningful life of the asset. So now we have not just a bid build, which often leads to inferior materials, inferior construction practices, and no thought about maintenance from the day the contractor leaves the site to where the contractor is going to be responsible for the asset, including maintenance for 25 years up to 99 years. What the P3 is about is what every single contract any of us has ever entered is about, and that's the transfer and management of risk. The government is now transferring that risk to the party that it believes can better manage the risk, i.e. the private sector. Here we have the private entity not only designing and constructing, but also maintaining and operating the roadway or bridge or other public structure. So this is way more than typical construction and way more than even design, bid, build. P3s can cover the entire risk. There's no one type of contract a P3 can apply to. But what we generally have is the private entity constructing the project and then leasing it back to the public entity until there's a certain point in time when the public entity regains control of the project. So we've talked about the structure of these projects. Here's where it gets really scary, and here's where you should care. About 150 years ago, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court accurately noted that in construction, getting paid is half the battle. So some people think that construction claims and construction payment disputes have only been in existence for the last 30 or 40 years since the construction bar became a force. But actually, this has been an issue going back to the 1800s. And the P3 legislations that were initially enacted in many states did not properly guarantee payment. And what I mean by that is, it's not exactly a public project, but it is enough of a public project to where you can't lien it in Pennsylvania. You cannot, let's say P3 redoes the Fort Pitt Bridge, you can't lien that Fort Pitt Bridge. But at the same time, there wasn't any protection provided by bonds and other guarantees in many states. So as a subcontractor specifically working in Ohio until recently, you didn't have a lien rate and you didn't have bond protection, which made getting paid a very scary proposition. What I would implore all of you to do before you jump into the P3 pool, especially in states other than PA or Ohio that we're going to talk about today, is before you go into any state to work, you always need to know what the rules are, as they vary greatly state to state. So to the extent you're going to do a P3 project in another state, you need to be an expert on that P3 law, just the way that every time you enter into a new state, you need to be an expert on the Prompt Payment Act in that state, if pay-if-paid provisions are enforceable in that state, what the bond and lien laws are in that state. If you don't do that, you're taking an exceptional risk and putting your company at jeopardy. So without that traditional statutory security, this has been a scary area for subcontractors and suppliers. Just a little more background on P3, and then we'll get into the heart of the matter. P3 legislation has been enacted in 33 states plus Puerto Rico, and as I said before, it's a whole new model. What we don't have is a uniform P3 statute. As a result, each state's P3 laws really vary tremendously, and you need to understand the legislation in each state. Sometimes it's 30 pages, sometimes it's hundreds of pages. So you really need to know what you're doing in each state. So let's talk about Pennsylvania first, because that's the state that's probably of most interest to many of you. What Pennsylvania states is payment bonds themselves are not required. However, some sort of guarantee is. It can be a letter of credit, any other form of security acceptable to the public entity. So in Pennsylvania, you have some protection, but if you're used to having a payment bond's not required in Pennsylvania, as we discussed last year. So some of what we're talking about is background, and for those of you sitting there saying, I know what he said last year, I memorized it, what's new? Let's talk about Ohio. Ohio is tremendously new this year. When we last spoke, I mentioned that Ohio didn't have any requirement for bonds. There was no security at all. If you were going on to a P3 in Ohio as a subcontractor, it was a very dangerous proposition. Well, in June of 2014, Ohio amended its P3 legislation to require performance and payment bonds for all P3 projects, and they got this enacted just in time in September of 14 for the Buckeyes to start their championship season, no doubt motivated by this new statute. So, and you note they did lose their first game, and I think that was before the P3 went into effect. So you could tell by December, January, they were quite motivated by this. So Ohio's now a safe place to be a subcontractor, or is it? Because in Ohio and Pennsylvania, the government's going to decide, the P3 owner's going to decide how much security is necessary. So while there will be bonds in Ohio and while there will be some sort of security required in Pennsylvania, it may not be 100% of the anticipated construction cost of the project, because remember, the government's really going to be paying the cost of these bonds indirectly. So you still have to be careful. You have to know what the security is going to be on your project, and if necessary, you need to be able to negotiate, because unlike a typical project that has 100% bond guaranteed, there is no such thing on P3 in Ohio and PA. Therefore, it's my recommendation, and I'm going to get the ivory tower look here in a second because I've done this presentation in a couple other venues, that you do try to get 100% of your cost as a subcontractor covered through a negotiation. You can always try. What we also don't know, because this law is so new, is how many tiers of subcontractors and suppliers will have bond rights in each state. All right, so what is actually happening? Are P3 projects really going on? And the answer is affirmatively yes. October 24th, 2014, PennDOT made a very large award. It selected Plenary Walsh Keystone Partners for its Rapid Bridge Replacement P3 project. And what we're talking about is 558 bridges to be completed within 36 months. That sounds pretty ambitious to me, but I'm sure Plenary Walsh knows what they're doing. More importantly, what of greater significance to us as taxpayers and as construction lawyers was the price. $899 million for 558 bridges. Now, in fairness, a lot of these are renovations, and a lot of these are not the Fort Pitt Bridge. Many of them are small bridges in middle of nowhere places that urbanites like me have never been to. So these aren't all huge bridges. However, it's still an aggressive price, and we'll get into that in a second. But what's interesting is there is a best value scoring method. For those of us who grew up in the 70s and in the 60s when boxing was a huge sport in America, we remembered the 10-point must scoring system. And there were a lot of controversial decisions. And that's what this sets up for. We have a subjective scoring method. And Walsh was picked under that. I'm not saying Walsh was or wasn't deserving. I wasn't a judge on that panel, so I don't know. But we have a lot of different subjective criteria that will be evaluated. So we're getting straying a little bit from the traditional lowest responsive and responsible bidder, where discretion does not factor in. We've got a lot of discretion here. So here's how it's going to work. The Commonwealth retains ownership of the bridge. Plenary Walsh has to maintain these bridges for 25 years. Key difference. So what PennDOT believed is that a 3-year construction process, just going back for a second, PennDOT expected 3 years. Walsh is expecting to do them in about 8 months faster than that. 28 years. 3 years construction, 25 years maintenance. That's a long time to be spending with 558 bridges. PennDOT thought it would be over $2 million per bridge. Rick Houseland actually thought it would be a little more than that. Walsh thinks that it's going to average out to about $1.6 million to construct and maintain each bridge. We'll see. It'll be real interesting to see how this works. So Commonwealth says it's saving all of us $217 million by doing this P3 rather than traditional procurement. As I said before, Walsh thinks they will save 8 months. So we have an owner and a private contractor with very different thoughts of how this job's going to go. Hopefully we're all going to save a lot of money. So one other thing to remember is Plenary Walsh is responsible for financing the project. With all these P3 projects, what we're seeing on the really big ones is sometimes huge contractors from Europe with huge bank deals are coming to finance these projects, because it's not a typical job where you're going to get paid in full as you build. That's not how this works. It's a long-term financial commitment with the contracting entity putting a lot of money up front. All right, so PennDOT was pretty happy with these results. They figured we'll try it again. Less than a week after Walsh's award, PennDOT announced that it plans to procure a private partner for a number of 37 different consolidated natural gas facilities throughout the Commonwealth. Once these facilities are up and operating, PennDOT will retain some of the fuel sales for revenues in capital projects. So the rest, we guess, will go to the private partners. So this is going to be the wave of the future in Pennsylvania. But right now, it is just limited to transportation projects. But we don't anticipate that is how things will continue to be. PennDOT's in the process of getting, once again, the statement of qualifications that will be scored. And then January 16th, they issued a press release selecting 4 teams from the initial scoring. And then we expect that later this summer, PennDOT will make public its final request for proposal. So this is how it's going to be. We have 4 shortlisted teams. If you're not on that list, you're not going to do these 37 facilities. So where is this going? Right now in both Pennsylvania and Ohio, we're limited to transportation, but legislation's already been proposed in both states to expand this dramatically. 2 House bills from 1314 was going to lead for all public projects potentially being available for P3. Another House bill of this year is looking at water and sewer projects in Pennsylvania being subject to P3. So there will be a lot of P3 work to come. One thing not on the slides, but West Virginia in late 2014 awarded its first P3 project, the Coalfields Expressway, 3 miles of highway transportation work. was awarded, and they immediately put another project up for P3. So this is the wave of the future in West Virginia as well. Thank you so much for coming out today, and we apologize for the rescheduling. Thank you.